Sicilian Mafia, Episode 4. Niccolò Rizzuto, the father of Montreal's Mafia. In the shadows of Sicily, one man carried the old world code across the ocean. Niccolò Rizzuto, the father of Montreal's Mafia, and the man who laid the foundation for a criminal dynasty. Before we dive into his rise, make sure to subscribe and join the Mob Truth family, where every episode brings you deeper into the real stories of Cosa Nostra. Early roots and migration. Niccolò Rizzuto was born in Cattolica Eraclea, a small Sicilian town where tradition and hardship walked hand in hand. Like many young men of his time, he grew up surrounded by whispers of Cosa Nostra's power. The Mafia wasn't just a rumor, it was part of everyday survival in post-war Sicily. By the 1950s, Italy was bleeding workers to the New World, and Niccolò joined the wave. He left Sicily behind and crossed the Atlantic, settling in Montreal, Canada. To outsiders, he was just another immigrant chasing opportunity. But behind his quiet presence, he carried the codes of the old country: omertà, loyalty, and ambition. Montreal was fertile ground. Different criminal groups competed for control, but there was no single unifying Sicilian boss. Niccolò saw the opening, and like a chess player setting his first pieces, he began moving carefully, patiently, preparing to carve out his place in a foreign land. Building a new mafia in Montreal. When Niccolò Rizzuto first arrived in Montreal, the underworld was already crowded. Calabrian clans, often linked to the 'Ndrangheta, had carved out pieces of the city's rackets. Niccolò was an outsider, a Sicilian among Calabrians. But he knew how to play the long game. He started by working quietly, forging alliances with fellow Sicilian immigrants. Unlike the loud displays of power common in America's mob, Niccolò preferred patience and subtlety. Step by step, the Sicilian faction in Montreal began to grow, and with it, his reputation as a man who could unite his people. What set him apart was vision. While others fought over local gambling halls and bars, Niccolò looked beyond to international connections, heroin routes, and ties back to Sicily. He wasn't just building a crew, he was laying the foundation of a dynasty. And in the streets of Montreal, people began to whisper his name with respect and caution. Consolidating power. By the late 1970s, Niccolò Rizzuto was no longer just another immigrant gangster. He was the head of a Sicilian faction that challenged the Calabrian hold on Montreal. His strength came not from violence alone, but from discipline. He brought the Sicilian code of omertà across the ocean and demanded absolute loyalty from his men. Niccolò understood that power in Canada meant more than local control. He linked with Cosa Nostra figures in New York and Sicily, making Montreal a hub for international drug routes. Court documents and police investigations would later show that shipments of heroin, moving through the infamous French Connection pipeline, passed through the networks tied to his faction. With every move, Niccolò tightened his grip. Rivals were pushed aside, alliances reinforced, and the Sicilian Mafia rose to dominance in Montreal. His leadership was clear. The old country's traditions could not only survive abroad, they could rule it. The family connection. For Niccolò Rizzuto, family was more than blood. It was the key to survival. As his power expanded, he began grooming his son, Vito, to take a central role in the organization. Niccolò represented the old world: tradition, caution, and silent authority. Vito, on the other hand, was sharper, modern, and comfortable bridging cultures. Together, they created something rare in Mafia history: a father and son dynasty that blended Sicily's old codes with North America's opportunities. According to Canadian court records and police investigations, Vito would later rise to become the most powerful mob boss Montreal had ever seen. But it was Niccolò who laid the groundwork, teaching him when to wait, when to strike, and how to wear respect like a crown. The name Rizzuto was no longer whispered. It was spoken openly in Montreal's underworld, a name that carried both fear and inevitability. Clashes and legacy. But no reign comes without enemies. As Niccolò's Sicilian faction grew, rival groups in Montreal, especially the Calabrians, pushed back. Violence flared, alliances shifted, and law enforcement began to close in on the Rizzuto network. According to police reports, Niccolò was repeatedly linked to drug trafficking and organized crime investigations. Yet for years, he managed to avoid the kind of convictions that could bring him down. His power came not just from money and soldiers, but from influence, connections that reached into politics and business. Still, shadows grew longer. The old patriarch became a symbol, the immigrant who had turned Montreal into a Sicilian stronghold. But with that reputation came risk. Every rival wanted to test him, and every government agency wanted to bring him down. Niccolò Rizzuto had built a dynasty, but in the world of Cosa Nostra, even dynasties are fragile. The fall of the Patriarch. By the early 2000s, cracks in the Rizzuto empire began to show. Law enforcement pressure was rising, and rival factions smelled opportunity. The dynasty Niccolò had created was powerful, but it was also a target. In 2006, tragedy struck. Canadian authorities confirmed that Niccolò's grandson, also named Niccolò, was shot dead in broad daylight. The message was unmistakable. The Rizzuto family was under siege. Then in 2010, the patriarch himself was killed inside his Montreal home. Reports say a sniper's bullet cut through the window of his study, ending the life of the man who had carried Sicily's code across the ocean. The murder shocked Canada, not only because of the violence, but because it marked the fall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Niccolò Rizzuto's death symbolized the end of an era. The patriarch who built Montreal's Sicilian Mafia had fallen, leaving behind both a dynasty and a battlefield for control. Legacy and impact. Niccolò Rizzuto's assassination was more than a family tragedy. It was a turning point in the history of organized crime in Canada. His death signaled the collapse of the Sicilian stronghold he had spent decades building. According to court filings and investigative reports, the power vacuum sparked a wave of violence in Montreal. Old rivals resurfaced, alliances crumbled, and the city's underworld descended into chaos. Yet even in death, Niccolò's name remained heavy. To many in Montreal's Italian community, he was the patriarch who carried Sicily to Canada, building a dynasty that reshaped the city's criminal landscape. To law enforcement, he was the architect of an empire that proved almost impossible to dismantle. And to his son Vito, still alive at the time of his father's murder, it was the most personal wound of all. A reminder that in the Mafia, even dynasties built on loyalty can end in blood. Alliances beyond Montreal. Niccolò Rizzuto understood that survival in Canada required more than local muscle. He forged deep alliances with Mafia families in New York, especially with the Bonanos, who saw Montreal as a key link in their international operations. According to court records, drug pipelines connected Sicily, Venezuela, the United States, and Canada. And the Rizzutos sat in the middle. Montreal became more than just a city, it was a bridge for Cosa Nostra's global business. These alliances made Niccolò powerful, but also vulnerable. By tying his family to the wider Mafia world, he brought both prestige and enemies from far beyond Canada's borders. Rivals and Montreal gang wars. The rise of Niccolò Rizzuto and his Sicilian faction did not go unchallenged. Montreal's underworld was a battlefield of cultures. The Calabrians, who had ruled for decades, refused to give up their grip without a fight. Through the 1970s and 1980s, blood was spilled in the streets. Bars, cafes, and alleyways became war zones where rival soldiers clashed for control of loan sharking, gambling, and smuggling routes. Each killing sent a message. Each bomb planted a reminder that no one was untouchable. Police reports from the era describe a pattern of tit-for-tat violence. A Calabrian capo would vanish, only for a Sicilian ally of Niccolò to meet the same fate days later. These wars carved deep scars into Montreal's criminal landscape, but they also cemented the reputation of the Rizzuto name. Unlike many of his rivals, Niccolò didn't rely on constant displays of violence. His power came from unity. He brought together Sicilian immigrants who longed for the traditions of the old country. In him, they found a leader who could outmaneuver the Calabrians, not just with bullets, but with patience, strategy, and international reach. By the late 1980s, the Sicilian faction was no longer an upstart movement. It was the dominant force in Montreal, and Niccolò was recognized as the Patriarch, the godfather whose word carried weight from the backrooms of Montreal cafes to the villas of Palermo. Police pressure and international heat. As the Sicilian faction grew stronger under Niccolò Rizzuto, law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic began to take notice. To the Canadian authorities, he was no longer just another immigrant boss. He was the man orchestrating a vast criminal empire that stretched far beyond Montreal. In Italy, prosecutors investigating the Sicilian Mafia repeatedly pointed to Rizzuto's name in connection with drug routes and international smuggling. The so-called Pizza Connection case, one of the largest heroin trafficking trials in history, revealed how Sicilian clans used North America as a staging ground. According to court documents, Montreal and New York became critical stops in that network, and Niccolò's faction was positioned right in the middle. The Canadian police stepped up surveillance. Wiretaps, hidden microphones, and undercover operations targeted the Rizzuto clan. But Niccolò was old school. He avoided phones, preferred face-to-face meetings, and insisted on coded messages. His discipline frustrated investigators, who often found themselves chasing shadows. Despite constant pressure, Niccolò managed to stay free. He had the patience of a chess master, always moving carefully, rarely giving law enforcement the one mistake they needed to bring him down. To his followers, this was proof of his wisdom. To his enemies, it was a reminder that the Patriarch was still untouchable. But the more his name appeared in international investigations, the more dangerous his position became. The Canadian authorities wanted him. The Americans kept watch. And in Sicily, his old allies were being hunted by the anti-mafia crusade led by judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. The world around Niccolò was shifting, and even a man as cautious as him could not escape the storm forever. The dynasty tested. By the 1990s, the Rizzuto Empire stood as the most powerful criminal organization in Canada. Niccolò Rizzuto had carved out a dynasty that blended Sicilian tradition with Canadian opportunity, but even dynasties face storms. Inside Montreal, jealousies grew, the Calabrian opposition never fully disappeared, and smaller independent crews resented the Sicilian dominance. Meanwhile, the Rizzuto family's success began drawing unwanted attention, not only from police but also from rival organizations, who saw an opening to challenge their grip. Law enforcement ramped up operations. Surveillance units tailed Niccolò's associates, and the Canadian media began portraying the Rizzutos as the Canadian Mafia, with Niccolò as its patriarch. According to investigators, he had become a symbol of organized crime in the country. A man whose shadow stretched over everything from construction contracts to drug pipelines. But with power came vulnerability. His son Vito was now recognized internationally as the boss, with ties extending to New York's Bonanno family and back to Sicily. That prominence was a double-edged sword. In 2004, Vito was arrested in connection with a triple homicide in New York, a case that shook the entire Rizzuto organization. For Niccolò, the arrest of his son was devastating. It was more than a legal blow. It threatened the very structure he had spent his life building. The Patriarch tried to hold the family together, stepping back into a more active role while Vito faced extradition and trial. But cracks were appearing. Rival factions in Montreal sensed weakness, and whispers of betrayal began circulating in the streets. Niccolò's leadership style, built on patience, respect, and subtle authority, was suddenly tested by forces beyond his control. International cases, prison sentences, and internal dissent all collided at once, and for the first time in decades, the Rizzuto dynasty no longer looked untouchable. What kept the family alive during this storm was the reputation Niccolò had built. Even as an aging boss, his name carried weight. Associates remembered the Sicilian code he enforced, the discipline he demanded, and the loyalty he inspired. For a while, that legacy was enough to keep the organization standing. But the storm clouds were gathering. With Vito behind bars and rivals circling like vultures, Niccolò knew the dynasty he had built was entering its most dangerous chapter. Blood on the Rizzuto name. In the world of Cosa Nostra, strength is measured not just in money or soldiers, but in the ability to survive when enemies smell blood. For the Rizzutos, that moment came in the mid-2000s, when the dynasty began to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. With Vito locked away in an American prison, the leadership vacuum in Montreal grew wider. Niccolò Rizzuto, already in his 80s, was forced back into the spotlight. He carried the respect of decades, but age had slowed him, and his enemies were younger, hungrier, and determined to break the Sicilian grip on the city. The first blow came in 2006 when tragedy struck the family itself. Niccolò's grandson, also named Niccolò, was assassinated in broad daylight. A brazen hit that shocked not just the Mafia world, but the entire Canadian public. According to police reports, the younger Rizzuto was gunned down in his car, a chilling message aimed directly at the Patriarch. The dynasty was vulnerable, and no bloodline was sacred. The murder sent ripples of fear through the organization. For decades, the Rizzuto name had been a shield. To kill a grandson, to strike at the very heart of the family, was a move designed to shatter that shield and prove that even the most powerful could bleed. Niccolò the Elder responded with the same stoicism that defined his life. He did not weep publicly, nor did he lash out recklessly. Instead, he tightened his circle, knowing that the storm had only begun. The streets of Montreal were shifting under his feet. Behind the scenes, rival factions maneuvered for position. Police intelligence files later revealed that Calabrian groups, sidelined for years, were plotting a return. Other independent crews smelled opportunity in the chaos. Every crack in the Rizzuto Foundation invited new challengers. And still, the Patriarch held on. He attended funerals, presided over family meetings, and tried to project the image of stability. But to those watching closely, the message was clear. The Rizzuto dynasty was under siege, and the blood spilled in 2006 was only the beginning. In organized crime, symbols matter. The murder of Niccolò's grandson wasn't just the loss of a family member, it was an attack on the very myth of invincibility that had protected the Rizzutos for decades. And once that myth was broken, the path to further bloodshed was wide open. The assassination of the Patriarch. On a quiet November evening in 2010, the life of Niccolò Rizzuto, Patriarch of Montreal's Sicilian Mafia, came to a violent end. The details of that night are carved into Canadian history. According to police reports, Niccolò was inside his Montreal home, sitting in his private study. It was the kind of room he retreated to often, lined with books, papers, and mementos of a life lived in power. Outside, the city moved on in silence, unaware that one of its most infamous figures was about to be struck down. A sniper took position in the shadows, his rifle trained on the lit window where the 86-year-old boss sat. At precisely the right moment, a single shot cracked the night. The bullet pierced the glass and struck Niccolò, killing him instantly. The hit was surgical. No mistakes, no warning, no chance for the old man to react. Law enforcement officials would later describe it as one of the most brazen assassinations in Canadian organized crime history. To kill the godfather of Montreal in his own home was more than murder. It was a statement. The Rizzuto dynasty was collapsing, and its enemies no longer feared the consequences. News of the killing spread quickly. Television screens lit up with reports, newspapers ran headlines about the death of Canada's Mafia patriarch, and the public watched in shock as images of Niccolò's home, now a crime scene, filled the airwaves. For decades, he had been a figure whispered about in cafes and courtrooms. Now his downfall was on display for the entire world. For the Underworld, the message was devastating. If Niccolò could be killed so openly, then no one was safe. Associates whispered about betrayal from within, about rivals who had finally taken their revenge, about the end of an era. Law enforcement, meanwhile, saw it as the symbolic collapse of the Sicilian Empire in Montreal. To his family, it was a tragedy beyond words. Niccolò Rizzuto had built a dynasty, only to see it dismantled piece by piece. First with the arrest of his son Vito, then the murder of his grandson, and finally his own assassination. In the cold arithmetic of organized crime, the sniper's bullet did more than end a life. It ended a reign, shattered the illusion of invulnerability, and turned the once feared name of Rizzuto into a symbol of fragility. The Patriarch was gone, and with him, the last thread of stability holding together Montreal's underworld. The aftermath in Montreal in chaos. The assassination of Niccolò Rizzuto did not just kill a man, It shattered the balance of power in Montreal. Within hours of his death, the city's underworld was thrown into chaos. According to investigators, rival factions wasted no time moving in. Old enemies resurfaced. Alliances that had held for decades crumbled overnight, and Montreal entered one of the bloodiest chapters in its criminal history. Bombings, drive-by shootings, and contract killings shook the city. Newspapers began calling it a Mafia civil war. For law enforcement, the sniper's bullet was a turning point. Years of investigations had failed to bring down the Patriarch, but now his death exposed the fractures in the organization for all to see. Police wiretaps recorded frantic conversations, associates scrambling to protect themselves, and whispers that the once mighty Sicilian dynasty was over. But even in collapse, the Rizzuto name carried weight. The memory of Niccolò, the immigrant who brought Sicilian discipline to Canada, lingered like a shadow over every move that followed. His death had ended his reign, but his story remained a warning. Power in the Mafia is never permanent, and even dynasties end in blood. This was the story of Niccolò Rizzuto, the patriarch who carried Sicily's code across the ocean, built a dynasty, and fell under the weight of betrayal and bullets. If you found this episode powerful, make sure to subscribe and join the Mob Truth family, where every week we bring you deeper into the real history of Cosa Nostra. And to our new subscribers, welcome soldiers. The family grows stronger with every story we tell. Until next time, remember, in this life, the truth always comes with a price.